Please don't take my daddy's house." The little girl's voice trembled through the freezing Colorado air just as the black SUV doors opened beside the gravel driveway. Snow drifted softly across the old pine trees surrounding the cabin, and for a moment, nobody moved. Ethan Cole stood on the porch in his faded denim jacket, one arm resting protectively around his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, while 3 men in dark overcoats stepped carefully through the snow carrying folders stamped with the logo of Sterling National Bank. Then she stepped out behind them. Tall, elegant, calm in the kind of way powerful people often are. Vivian Sterling adjusted the collar of her charcoal wool coat as icy wind swept strands of blonde hair across her face. Her heels pressed lightly into the snow while her eyes lifted toward the small cabin sitting beneath the mountains. The place looked worn but alive. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Christmas lights, half broken, still hung along the porch roof even though January had already settled deep into the valley. Vivian's expression barely changed as one of the bank attorneys handed Ethan the foreclosure notice. "Mr. Cole," the man said carefully, "under Section 8 of the revised lending agreement, Sterling National now assumes possession of the property effective immediately." Lily grabbed tighter onto her father's hand. "Daddy," Ethan said nothing. His jaw tightened slightly as his eyes stayed locked on Vivian. And then something strange happened. Something small. Something almost invisible. Vivian looked back at him, and for half a second, her perfectly controlled expression faltered. Not recognition. Not yet. Just a flicker. Like a memory trying to breathe beneath ice. Ethan knew that face. Even beneath the polished makeup and corporate armor. He knew it. 3 nights earlier, he had carried that same woman through smoke and falling snow while the wreckage of a private plane groaned against the mountainside. He remembered the weight of her body against his chest. The freezing wind clawing through burned metal. The weak sound of her voice near his shoulder. "Don't let me die." But standing here now, surrounded by lawyers, and black vehicles worth more than his entire life savings, she looked nothing like the frightened stranger he had pulled from the wreckage. She looked untouchable. Lily stepped forward suddenly, her pink boots crunching against fresh snow. Her cheeks were red from the cold, but her eyes stayed fixed on Vivian. "My daddy's a good man," she whispered. One of the lawyers looked away uncomfortably. Vivian remained still. "Sometimes," she finally said quietly, "good people still lose their homes." Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time. Not in shame, not in fear, just exhaustion. The kind carried by a man who had spent years surviving one heartbreak at a time without ever allowing himself to become bitter. The mountain wind moved softly through the pines behind them, carrying the scent of snow and cedar across the silent property. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the valley. And standing there in the frozen stillness of that small Colorado town, none of them yet understood that this foreclosure was about to uncover a truth powerful enough to bring an empire to its knees. 3 days earlier, the storm had rolled across the Colorado mountains like something alive. Snow slammed against Ethan Cole's windshield in thick, white waves while the tires of his old Ford pickup fought for traction along the narrow canyon road. The heater rattled weakly beside him, pushing out uneven warmth that smelled faintly of dust and engine oil. Beside him on the passenger seat sat a paper bag filled with canned soup, medicine, and a pair of pink winter gloves Lily had begged him to buy from the grocery store clearance bin earlier that afternoon. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock. 7:42 p.m., too late to still be on the mountain roads. But old Mrs. Brenner up near Silver Ridge had called saying her furnace stopped working again, and Ethan had never learned how to ignore people who needed help. Maybe that was his problem. The windshield wipers groaned back and forth while the storm thickened around him. Pine trees bent hard under the wind, their dark silhouettes twisting against flashes of distant lightning somewhere beyond the mountains. Then suddenly, the world changed. A deafening roar thundered overhead. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel as a low-flying aircraft burst through the clouds above the canyon. Too low. Far too low. Its lights flickered violently through the blizzard before the engine coughed with a terrible metallic shudder that echoed through the valley. Ethan slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded sideways across ice before stopping near the edge of the road. For one frozen second, everything went silent except for the wind. Then came the impact. A distant explosion rolled through the mountains like thunder trapped beneath stone. Orange light burst against the snow-covered ridge half a mile ahead. Ethan stared toward the smoke rising into the storm. His breathing slowed. Most people would have called emergency services and stayed inside the truck where it was safe. Most people had something left to lose. Ethan reached for his coat and stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit instantly, sharp enough to steal breath from his lungs. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he climbed through dense trees toward the crash site, the wind howling louder with every step. Branches snapped somewhere in the darkness. Smoke thickened in the air, carrying the bitter scent of burning fuel and melted metal. When he finally reached the ridge, the sight stopped him cold. The small private jet had broken apart across the hillside. Its tail lodged between pine trees while scattered debris smoldered across the snow like fallen stars. Flames flickered weakly against the storm. Ethan scanned the wreckage desperately. Then he heard it. A faint sound, barely more than a breath beneath the wind. He moved carefully through the debris until he saw her lying against a drift of snow near the shattered cabin section. A woman, blonde hair dusted with ice, dark coat torn along one sleeve. Blood traced lightly across her forehead, but her chest still rose in shallow breaths. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey," he said gently, his voice calm despite the storm around them. "Stay with me, all right?" Her eyes fluttered weakly. Gray eyes, sharp even through fear. She reached for his jacket with trembling fingers. "Please," she whispered faintly. "Do not leave me here." Ethan looked once toward the burning wreckage behind him, then back at the woman clinging to consciousness in the snow. And without hesitation, he lifted her carefully into his arms and carried her into the storm. The emergency room at St. Helena Regional Hospital smelled like antiseptic, wet wool, and burnt coffee from the overnight nurse's station. Snow hammered softly against the tall glass windows while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that cold hospital hum that made every hour feel the same. Ethan sat alone near the end of the hallway, his hands wrapped around a paper cup that had long gone cold. The sleeves of his denim jacket were still damp from melted snow, and faint traces of smoke clung stubbornly to the fabric. Across from him, paramedics moved quickly between rooms while doctors spoke in low, urgent voices near the intensive care wing. Ethan barely listened. His eyes stayed fixed on the closed door at the far end of the corridor where the woman had disappeared nearly an hour earlier. One of the nurses approached, carefully holding a clipboard against her chest. "Mr. Cole," Ethan looked up slowly. "The woman you brought in is stable." He exhaled quietly for the first time since leaving the mountainside. "Good. You probably saved her life," the nurse continued gently. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the untouched coffee in his hands. "Anybody would have done it." The nurse glanced toward the snowstorm outside the windows. "No," she said softly. "Not in weather like that." Before Ethan could answer, the automatic hospital doors burst open and a wave of sharply dressed people rushed inside carrying phones, briefcases, and winter coats dusted with snow. Two men in dark suits moved directly toward the front desk, while a woman with silver-framed glasses spoke rapidly into a cell phone. "We need the entire floor secured immediately," she said. "No press access. No statements until legal arrives." Ethan frowned slightly as the energy inside the hallway shifted. Even the nurses straightened instinctively. A younger doctor hurried from the intensive care room, carrying a chart. She regained consciousness. Briefly, he announced, "Vitals are improving." The woman with glasses closed her eyes with visible relief. "Thank God." Ethan stood slowly from his chair. "Is she going to be okay?" The entire group turned toward him at once, as if noticing him for the first time. Their eyes moved over his worn boots, smoke-stained jacket, rough hands. The woman stepped forward carefully. "And you are?" "Ethan Cole," he answered simply. "I brought her in." Something changed in the room. The younger doctor blinked. "Wait, you are the one who carried her down the ridge." Ethan nodded once. Silence settled for half a second before one of the suited men spoke quietly under his breath. "Jesus Christ." The woman adjusted her glasses again, studying Ethan more carefully now. "Mr. Cole," she said slowly, "do you have any idea who that woman is?" Ethan shook his head. "No, ma'am." The woman hesitated as if deciding how much to reveal. Then finally she answered, "That is Vivian Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling National Bank." Ethan stared at her blankly. The name meant nothing at first. Just another wealthy executive from another world far away from his mountain town. But then he remembered the billboard near the interstate. Sterling National, the same bank whose letters had been arriving in his mailbox for months. Final notices, missed payments, foreclosure warnings. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the paper cup. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeped steadily inside Vivian's hospital room while snow continued falling across the dark Colorado mountains outside. And for reasons he could not yet explain, a strange heaviness settled quietly inside his chest. By the time Ethan finally returned home, the mountains had disappeared beneath nearly 14 inches of fresh snow. His truck crawled slowly up the narrow dirt road leading toward the cabin while weak yellow headlights cut through the darkness ahead. The engine rattled softly beneath him, exhausted from years of surviving winters far harsher than mechanics ever recommended. Ethan drove in silence. His hands rested heavily against the steering wheel while the words from the hospital repeated quietly in his mind. Sterling National Bank, the same bank preparing to take everything he had left. He pulled into the driveway just after midnight. Warm amber light glowed through the cabin windows, and for the first time that night, some of the tightness inside his chest eased. Before he could even shut off the truck, the front door burst open. "Daddy!" Lily ran through the snow in oversized socks and a blue blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape. Ethan stepped out just in time to catch her as she threw her arms around his waist. "You scared me," she whispered against his jacket. Ethan held her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of cinnamon shampoo and laundry soap. "I am okay, sweetheart." Behind her, old Martha Brenner stood in the doorway holding a steaming mug between weathered hands. "You look like hell, Ethan," she muttered gently. Ethan gave a tired smile. "Good evening to you too, Martha." The elderly woman shook her head and stepped aside so they could enter. Warm air wrapped around them instantly, carrying the smell of tomato soup and burning pine wood from the stove. The cabin itself was small and worn with age, but alive in all the ways expensive houses often were not. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator door. A half-repaired wooden chair sat near the fireplace. Tiny fingerprints smudged the lower corners of the windows, where Lily liked to watch snowstorms roll through the valley. Ethan removed his coat slowly, wincing as stiffness pulled through his shoulders. Martha noticed immediately. "You are hurt. Just tired." "MMHM." She handed him the mug anyway. "Hospital called earlier. They said you left before the police finished taking statements." Ethan stared into the steam rising from the coffee. "I did not think it mattered." Martha snorted softly. "Boy, when rich people crash airplanes in your backyard, it matters." Lily climbed onto the couch beside the fire, her small face serious now. "Did the lady survive?" Ethan nodded once. "Yeah, she did." Lily smiled softly with visible relief. "Good." Ethan looked at his daughter carefully. Even after losing her mother 3 years earlier, Lily still carried kindness in her like it was something natural. Something untouched by the cruelty life had already shown her. Sometimes that frightened him more than anything else. Martha gathered her coat near the door. "You need rest," she said. "Both of you." Ethan walked her outside while snow drifted lazily through the porch light. Before leaving, Martha hesitated near her old station wagon. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I heard another notice came from the bank yesterday." Ethan lowered his eyes slightly. "Yeah. How long?" "Maybe 30 days. Martha's expression tightened with sadness. "This valley has forgotten what decent men look like." Ethan leaned lightly against the porch railing as cold wind moved through the trees behind them. "No," he said softly. "It just remembers money better." After Martha drove away, Ethan remained outside alone for a while. The mountains stood silent beneath the moonlight while snow covered the world in perfect white stillness. Inside the cabin, Lily laughed softly at some cartoon playing on the old television. It was a small sound. Fragile. Beautiful. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, listening to it. Because deep down, he already knew something painful was coming toward their little home through the snow. Morning arrived gray and bitter cold across Silver Ridge. Thin smoke curled from cabin chimneys while snowplows groaned slowly down the main road, pushing aside drifts nearly 3 feet high. Inside the diner on Maple Street, the scent of bacon grease and burnt toast filled the warm air, while tired ranchers and construction workers crowded into booths nursing coffee before another hard day in the mountains. Ethan sat alone near the window with a plate of untouched eggs growing cold in front of him. He wore the same denim jacket from the night before. Though the smoke smell had faded beneath fresh sawdust from the morning repair job, he had finished before sunrise. Across the diner, an old television mounted above the counter flickered with breaking news coverage from Denver. Sterling National Chief Executive Officer Vivian Sterling expected to make full recovery following private aircraft accident near Silver Ridge, the reporter announced brightly. Ethan kept his eyes lowered. Toward his coffee. That her? The waitress asked quietly as she topped off his mug. Ethan nodded once. Sandy Mitchell had known Ethan nearly 15 years. Long enough to recognize the silence he carried when something weighed heavily on him. You save her? She asked carefully. Ethan stared through the frosted diner window where snow drifted lazily across parked trucks outside. I just found her first. Sandy folded her arms. That is not what the sheriff said. Ethan gave the faintest tired smile. Sheriff talks too much. Before Sandy could answer, the bell above the diner door jingled sharply. Conversation inside the room faded almost instantly. 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop outside beneath falling snow. And moments later, several sharply dressed people stepped carefully into the diner, carrying tablets, folders, and expensive winter coats that looked absurd against muddy boots and flannel jackets. Then Vivian Sterling entered behind them. The room went completely still. She moved with controlled confidence despite the faint bruise still visible near her temple. Her dark wool coat fell neatly to her knees, while silver earrings caught the pale morning light from the windows. But there was something different about her now. Something quieter beneath the polished surface. Her gray eyes scanned the diner carefully until they landed on Ethan sitting alone near the window. Ethan looked up slowly. Neither of them spoke at first. The cook behind the counter lowered the volume on the television. Somewhere near the kitchen, a coffee cup clinked softly against ceramic. Vivian stepped closer. Mr. Cole. Ethan nodded politely. Ma'am. One of her assistants immediately pulled out papers from a leather folder. We appreciate your assistance during the accident, the man began formally. Miss Sterling wishes to offer compensation for your actions. Ethan's expression barely changed. Vivian glanced toward the folder briefly before looking back at him. You saved my life, she said quietly. Thank you. Ethan rested his rough hands around the warm coffee mug. You do not owe me anything. The assistant slid a check across the table anyway. Ethan glanced down at the number and immediately pushed it back untouched. Several people inside the diner exchanged confused looks. Vivian frowned slightly. Most people would not refuse that amount. Ethan finally met her eyes directly. Calm. Steady. Most people are probably smarter than me. A few soft chuckles rose from nearby tables, but Vivian did not smile. She studied him carefully now as if trying to understand something that did not fit inside the world she knew. Sheriff said you are behind on your mortgage. One of the bank attorneys interrupted bluntly. Ethan's eyes shifted toward him. The warmth in the diner seemed to vanish all at once. Vivian looked sharply toward the attorney, clearly irritated by the comment. But the damage was already done. Several townspeople lowered their eyes awkwardly. Ethan leaned back slowly in the booth. Looks like your bank knows everything about me already. Outside, snow continued falling across the small mountain town, while somewhere deep inside Vivian Sterling, a quiet unease began to grow. That evening, the storm finally eased over Silver Ridge, leaving the town buried beneath a quiet blanket of fresh snow that reflected pale blue moonlight across the valley. Inside the Sterling National Temporary Command Office set up in the historic Aspen Ridge Lodge, warmth and luxury replaced the rough simplicity Ethan called home. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the mountains while expensive whiskey bottles lined polished shelves beside a roaring stone fireplace. Executives moved through the lobby speaking in low voices, their polished shoes tapping softly against marble floors. Vivian stood alone, near the glass, overlooking the valley below. In the distance, tiny cabin lights glowed between dark pine trees like scattered lanterns against the snow. One of those lights belonged to Ethan Cole. She could not stop thinking about him. The way he refused the check. The calm in his eyes. The exhaustion hidden beneath his quiet voice. Most people spent their lives trying to impress powerful people. Ethan had looked at her like she was simply another tired human being standing in the cold. You are distracted. Vivian turned as Charles Whitmore stepped into the room adjusting the cuffs of his expensive Navy suit. Chairman of Sterling National. 70 years old. sharp-minded and colder than the winter outside. He handed her a digital tablet. The Silver Ridge acquisition documents. Vivian skimmed the files silently. Resort development permits. Land transfer requests. Foreclosure schedules. Then she saw the address again. Ethan Cole. Cabin Lot 17. Her expression tightened slightly. Why is one missed mortgage being escalated this aggressively? Charles gave a faint impatient sigh. Because that mountain corridor is the key access point to the airport expansion project. Vivian looked up slowly. Airport. Private aviation terminal. Luxury resort partnership. Investors from California are already involved. He stepped beside her, overlooking the valley lights below. That entire section of land triples in value once development begins. Vivian lowered the tablet slightly. And Ethan Cole just happens to own the last holdout property. Charles smiled thinly. Now you understand. Silence settled between them while firelight flickered softly against the windows behind them. Vivian's eyes drifted back toward the mountains. You never mentioned any of this before the foreclosure process started. Charles shrugged lightly. You were in a coma 48 hours ago. Timing was unfortunate. Vivian's jaw tightened subtly. He saved my life. Charles turned toward her fully now. And that is precisely why you need distance. Gratitude clouds judgment. Vivian said nothing. Charles continued calmly. Good men exist everywhere, Vivian. That does not make them financially useful. Something about the sentence landed wrong inside her chest. Cold. Hollow. Outside the lodge, snow slid gently from rooftops while wind whispered through the frozen trees. Vivian remembered Ethan carrying her through the storm. The smell of smoke in his jacket. The steady sound of his heartbeat while everything around them burned and collapsed into darkness. He had risked his life for someone he did not even know. No cameras. No publicity. No transaction. Just instinctive human decency. She had spent years surrounded by powerful men who measured every relationship in percentages and leverage. Ethan Cole had walked away from a check large enough to erase his debt without hesitation. There is more, Charles added quietly. Vivian looked back at him. The foreclosure hearing is already scheduled for Friday morning. Friday. We cannot delay investor timelines because of sentiment. Vivian stared down at the file in silence. Her fingers slowly tightened around the edges of the tablet. Somewhere deep beneath the polished armor she had built around herself for years, something painful began to awaken. Not pity, not guilt, something more dangerous. Respect. And for the first time since taking over Sterling National, Vivian Sterling suddenly was not sure the people sitting around her boardroom table were the good guys. Friday morning arrived with a pale silver sunrise spreading slowly across the mountains above Silver Ridge. The courthouse sat at the center of town wrapped in fresh snow, its old brick walls glowing softly beneath the winter light, while pickup trucks lined the icy streets outside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wet coats, old paper, and burnt coffee drifting from a machine near the clerk's office. Ethan stood quietly near the back of the hearing room, adjusting the collar of his only dress shirt beneath a worn brown jacket. Lily sat beside him, swinging her boots nervously above the floor, while coloring on the back of an old receipt with crayons she kept in her backpack. Every few seconds, she glanced toward her father with worried eyes much older than a 9-year-old should have carried. Daddy, she whispered softly, are we really losing the house today? Ethan knelt beside her chair carefully. I do not know yet, sweetheart. Lily lowered her voice further. But you saved her. Ethan looked toward the courtroom doors where lawyers from Sterling National were already arranging stacks of documents across polished tables. Sometimes people forget things when money gets involved, he answered gently. Before Lily could reply, the room suddenly quieted. Vivian Sterling entered surrounded by attorneys and executives wearing dark tailored coats that seemed almost unreal against the small town. Courthouse. Her heels clicked softly across the wooden floor while cameras from local news stations flashed near the entrance. But Vivian barely noticed any of it. Her eyes found Ethan almost immediately. He stood exactly the same way he had during the storm. Calm. Protective. Quietly carrying the weight of everyone around him without asking for recognition. Vivian's chest tightened unexpectedly. She moved toward the front table while Charles Whitmore leaned closer beside her. Once this hearing concludes, he murmured, construction teams can begin surveys by Monday. Vivian did not answer. The judge entered moments later, and the hearing began with cold legal language bouncing across the room like mechanical noise stripped of humanity. Loan default, asset transfer, property reclamation. Ethan listened silently while lawyers discussed his home like it was an abandoned storage shed instead of the place where his daughter learned to walk after her mother died. Finally, the judge adjusted his glasses and looked toward Ethan directly. "Mr. Cole, do you wish to make a statement before final review?" Ethan stood slowly. The courtroom became still. Even the reporters lowered their cameras slightly. Ethan cleared his throat once. "I know I fell behind on payments," he said calmly. "I am not asking for pity. I just needed more time." One of the Sterling attorneys immediately interrupted. "Your Honor, extensions were already provided multiple times." Ethan nodded quietly. "That is true." He glanced briefly toward Lily before continuing. "My wife passed away 3 years ago. Medical bills took most of what we had. After that, I did what I could." Silence settled over the courtroom. No dramatics. No begging. Just truth spoken plainly by a tired man with nothing left except dignity. Then something unexpected happened. Lily suddenly stood from her chair. "My daddy fixes everyone's houses when storms break things," she blurted out emotionally. "He brings groceries to old people. He even saved Mrs. Brenner's dog last winter." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Lily." But the little girl kept going, tears filling her voice now. She turned toward Vivian directly. "And he saved you, too." The room froze completely. Vivian stared at the child standing there with trembling hands and red cheeks beneath fluorescent courtroom lights. "If my daddy saved your life," Lily whispered painfully, "why are you taking ours?" No one moved. No one spoke. Somewhere near the back of the room, a chair creaked softly against the floor. And for the first time in many years, Vivian Sterling felt something crack quietly inside her heart. The silence inside the courtroom lingered long after Lily's words faded into the cold fluorescent air. Even the judge remained motionless behind the bench, his hands folded quietly, while reporters near the back lowered their cameras with uncomfortable expressions. Vivian could still hear the little girl's voice echoing inside her chest. "If my daddy saved your life, why are you taking ours?" Ethan slowly rested a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder and guided her back into her seat. "It is okay, sweetheart," he whispered softly. But Vivian noticed something painful in his eyes now. Not anger, not resentment, disappointment. The kind carried by someone who expected nothing from the world anymore and still somehow managed to be hurt when it proved him right. Charles Whitmore leaned toward Vivian immediately. "Do not react emotionally," he muttered under his breath. "This is exactly why business requires distance." Vivian barely heard him. Her attention stayed fixed on Ethan sitting quietly beside his daughter beneath the harsh courtroom lights. His boots were worn, his jacket sleeves frayed near the cuffs, and yet somehow he still carried more dignity than most executives she had spent her life surrounded by. One of the attorneys suddenly stood again. "Your Honor, Sterling National respectfully requests immediate transfer of property ownership due to repeated loan delinquency." The judge nodded slowly while reviewing documents. Under current financial statutes, the bank appears legally entitled to proceed. Lily lowered her eyes toward the floor. Ethan exhaled quietly through his nose and stared ahead in silence. Vivian's fingers tightened slowly around the edge of the table. Then something caught her attention. A thin red folder, partially visible beneath the foreclosure documents. She frowned slightly and pulled it free. "What is this?" Charles glanced toward it casually. "Supplemental acquisition analysis." Vivian opened the file. Her expression changed almost immediately. Hidden investor memos, internal projections, private land valuations. The cabin property alone had been secretly estimated at nearly $12 million once the airport expansion finalized. Her eyes moved lower across the page. Strategic pressure recommendations. Accelerated foreclosure authorization. Minimal borrower negotiation advised. Vivian looked up sharply toward Charles. "You manipulated the timeline." Charles remained perfectly calm. "We protected shareholder interests. You targeted him specifically because he would not sell. Because he could not afford not to." The words landed like ice water through the room around them. Vivian stared at the papers in disbelief while pieces finally locked together inside her mind. Ethan's missed payments. The rushed legal schedule. The refusal to offer restructuring. None of it had been ordinary banking procedure. This was never about debt. It was about land. Valuable land owned by a quiet man too decent to fight dirty. Vivian slowly stood from her chair. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Charles lowered his voice sharply. Sit down. But Vivian no longer sounded like the polished executive the board controlled. You used my accident to force this through while I was unconscious. Charles's expression hardened. Careful, Vivian. She turned toward the judge directly. Your Honor, Sterling National formally requests an immediate suspension of foreclosure proceedings pending internal fraud review. The entire courtroom erupted into whispers. One of the attorneys stood abruptly. Miss Sterling, you cannot make that decision unilaterally. Vivian's eyes flashed toward him with sudden steel. I am Chief Executive Officer. Watch me. Silence crashed across the room again. Even the reporters froze. Ethan stared at her quietly from across the courtroom, confusion mixing with something deeper in his tired eyes. Vivian looked toward him fully now. For the first time since the plane crash, she finally saw him clearly. Not as a borrower, not as a liability, but as the man who had carried her through fire and snow without asking for anything in return. And suddenly the entire world she had spent years building around money and power no longer felt nearly as strong as one exhausted father holding his little girl's hand in silence. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Silver Ridge over the following weeks. Snow melted from cabin rooftops in soft, dripping rhythms, while rivers of cold mountain water cut through the valleys carrying away the last traces of ice. News of the Sterling National scandal spread far beyond Colorado. Financial networks dissected leaked documents nightly, while reporters crowded outside corporate headquarters in New York demanding answers about fraudulent foreclosure practices tied to luxury development projects. Several executives resigned within days. Others disappeared behind teams of attorneys and carefully rehearsed statements. But in Silver Ridge, life moved more quietly. Ethan spent most mornings repairing storm-damaged fences across neighboring ranches, while Lily returned to school, carrying the same pink backpack with one broken zipper she refused to replace. The cabin remained theirs, fully protected under a new legal settlement personally signed by Vivian Sterling herself. Ethan never asked how much fighting it took behind closed boardroom doors to make that happen. Maybe because some people who carried real strength did not need applause to prove it existed. One late afternoon in early spring, Ethan stood outside, sanding a cedar rocking chair beneath golden sunlight spilling across the mountains. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine needles warming beneath the sun. Inside the cabin, old country music played softly through a radio while Lily colored at the kitchen table. Peaceful, simple, the kind of life powerful people often spent millions trying unsuccessfully to buy. Then the sound of tires crunching slowly along gravel echoed up the driveway. Ethan looked up. A single dark SUV rolled carefully to a stop near the porch. No reporters. No security convoy. No lawyers. Vivian stepped out alone wearing jeans, boots, and a cream-colored sweater beneath a simple brown coat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Wind moved gently through the pine trees surrounding the cabin, while distant birds called somewhere beyond the valley. Vivian looked different now. Less polished. Less guarded. More human somehow. She walked toward the porch slowly, almost uncertain. I was not sure if I should come, she admitted quietly. Ethan rested the sandpaper against the arm of the chair. You came anyway. A faint smile touched her lips for the first time since they met. Before either of them could say more, the cabin door burst open. Daddy, the cookies are burning again. Lily froze halfway onto the porch when she saw Vivian standing there. Her eyes widened instantly. Then slowly, carefully, she smiled. You came back. Something fragile moved across Vivian's face at those words. Relief. Sadness. Maybe even gratitude. Lily ran down the porch steps and hugged her without hesitation. Vivian knelt carefully, holding the little girl as spring wine drifted softly through the valley around them. Ethan watched quietly from the porch. Months ago, he had carried a frightened stranger through smoke and snow believing he would never see her again. Now here she stood beneath warm mountain sunlight with tears quietly shining in her gray eyes, while his daughter laughed against her shoulder. Some miracles arrived loudly with flashing lights and crowds cheering. Others arrived quietly, like forgiveness, like second chances, like the sound of a lonely woman finally exhaling after years of carrying the weight of a world built on money instead of mercy. Vivian slowly looked up toward Ethan. He said nothing. He only gave the smallest nod, steady and calm like always. And standing there beneath the endless Colorado sky, surrounded by melting snow, cedar wood, and the quiet heartbeat of a simple home, Vivian Sterling realized something no boardroom had ever taught her. The strongest people in the world were often the ones who stayed kind after life gave them every reason not to be. The wind moved gently through the mountains. Somewhere inside the cabin, the radio played softly, and for the first time in a very long while, silence no longer felt lonely.